Right back at you. There is a four-word mantra that seems appropriate for us believers. It's one of those kind of things you could wear, on the little wristband so that every time you look down at it, you remember who you belong to and what your allegiance is to. Or maybe it's the kind of thing we make more permanent like we do these days and put it on the forearm, a tattoo. Not that I'm advocating that all 600 of you go out and get a tattoo this weekend, but so much of who we are is tied up in this little statement. Jesus said it in our passage today in Mark 10, 4 words, "Not so with you." He doesn't say it in other passages, but it is so certainly inferred if you just look at the Sermon on the Mount. He says, yeah, there's going to be some people that lay up treasures just to use here on earth. Not so with you. There's going to be people that seek revenge. Not so with you. There's people that are going to worry about what to wear and what to eat. Not so with you. There's even going to be people that are foolish enough to build their lives on sand, but not so with you. It is the mantra of the paradoxical kingdom, the upside down kingdom that puts everything right side up. And today we examine another one of those paradoxes of the kingdom. It comes up in a conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. Let me just set the scene for a moment. This is toward the final act of Jesus. He is winding up his teachings out on the road, and now he is headed toward Jerusalem. The disciples are with him, and there's a crowd with him also. To watch Jesus start this pilgrimage with such determination, his face set like flint, the unwavering focus of his attention. People notice, they couldn't help but notice. The disciples are astonished. They're in wonderment of what he's about to do. And the crowds, they're fearful. Jesus has talked on 2 other occasions we know of his impending death and resurrection. But this time he gets more specific. So imagine with me, this is not a party mood on the way to Jerusalem. This is not balloons and confetti. This is not skipping to Jerusalem. This is something is going down in Jerusalem. And it was sobering, to say the least. And just when you think then that empathy and compassion for Jesus would be so evident among the disciples, the script takes an unexpected turn. Listen to what Mark 10, verses 35, 38 say. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." That's a dangerous thing. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. And they replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." I think it's really odd to not be giving support to Jesus at this time. It doesn't even seem to be on James and John's radar. But what is on their radar, what they do manage to do, is take him aside and use the opportunity to try to convince Jesus that they need primary seats on his cabinet. Kudos to the disciples. I think they really understood that he was on the verge of changing history. I think they thought it was going to happen through a military coup. But they recognize something. And they also, I'm thinking, who wouldn't want to be on that side? To finally give the Romans a taste of some of their own medicine. And so the sons of thunder used the opportunity to try to secure their positions of power. I find it fascinating that these men had sat under the teachings of Jesus for 3 years. They know they are the not so with you people. And yet, isn't it interesting? They have such an acute awareness of where the head of the table is. Their eyes may have been focused on Jerusalem, but not for the same reason as their master. Jesus was focused on Jerusalem for a cross. The disciples were focused on Jerusalem for a crown. For goodness sakes, the pastime of the disciples had seemed to be deciding and arguing who was the greatest in the kingdom. They were still doing it the night of right before his crucifixion. You've heard people say before, old habits die hard, old ways of thinking die hard. And this was certainly an old way of thinking. Clear back to Adam and Eve in a garden with a piece of fruit. I want you to put this in your back pocket, people, and keep it with you all the time. Just as he did in the garden, Satan will advise, he will prod, he will woo, he will cheerlead you into acting on your own selfish ambition under the guise of ministry even, and maybe especially under the guise of ministry, because he relishes in the evil results it can produce. Jesus' response to their request, guys, you don't even know what you're asking. He follows that up with some pretty difficult words, and we don't have the time to look into those now. By now, the other disciples have shown up, and they're upset with James and John. They're not just upset. The scripture says they were indignant. Why were they indignant? Because they hadn't shown compassion to Jesus? No, because James and John had beat them to the punch. They wanted to secure those positions of power for themselves. So Jesus calls them together, and he gives perhaps his one and only leadership seminar. So you better tune into this, people, because it shows again how they put the emphasis on the wrong thing. Mark 10 says this, verse 42 through 45. You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Say that with me. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Let's face it, the thought of being a leader, or what they call an influencer these days, boy, it pulls at our ego, doesn't it? It's attractive, it's enticing, it's, as the culture would say, sexy, and it sells. I was having a conversation the other day with Justin Gill and Emma Hallback. I was just over in the library for a little bit, and as I was in Emma's office, I asked her, I said, how many books do you suppose in our library, the books on leadership as compared to the books on servanthood? I said, what do you think the comparison would be? And we just kind of talked about it, left it alone. Well, Emma sends me an email later on, and I appreciated it so much because she was just curious enough to find out. She did a keyword search in our library just on leadership, leaders, and it totaled 3,068 books. And then she did a keyword search under servanthood, and the total was 552. 6-1, leadership wins. Except that Jesus said, not so with you. Jesus came to serve. Disciples had watched miracle after miracle that Jesus did, but never one time for his own selfish ambition. They had gone begrudgingly with him to Samaria. I'm sure it wasn't a Jew's favorite tourist destination, but they wind up going to Samaria, and they just for the specific reason of seeing one woman who had had 5 husbands in the past and now living with a man that was not her husband. And Jesus goes to offer living water to that woman. What's that about? He leaned down to a woman, they watched him do this, who had been caught in adultery. And he said, "Is anyone left here to condemn you? Neither do I. Now go and sin no more." They watched as a leper came to Jesus and said, "I know if you're willing, you can make me clean." And to their shock, Jesus grabs that man still with leprosy and says, "I am willing." John puts in his gospel at the end of it, he makes this comment. He said, Jesus did many other things. I'm sure the world could not contain all the books that would be written if they were actually to be written down. These men had saw Jesus serving with humility, putting others above himself. Make no mistake about this, people. Your king was a servant. And he calls you to be one as well. He's not really concerned about your leadership abilities. True kingdom leadership, and I'm talking kingdom leadership. I'm not talking about world's leadership. They can do their thing. We're the not so with you people. So true kingdom leadership will never be born from our talents or our abilities or our charisma, no matter what the new bestseller book may tell you. No, true kingdom leadership is born and matured from servanthood. Servanthood is the door for leading. Actually, at each entrance to this college, there ought to be a sign that says servant's entrance, because that's who we are. It's got to be there. So what is the paradigm shift that needs to happen in our own thinking? The first thing I want to just say is you've got to think low to know your true title. Everyone has a title, a description of who they think they are. And it's because ever since we've grown up as little kids, we've been told that titles give you value. I've never once encountered a person that says something like, "Hi, I'm Mike, and I'm a loser." No. We don't do that. We want to be known by something that gives us worth. So we'll hear things like, "I'm a senior and I'm working on my BTH," or "I'm a basketball player," or "I'm a musician for Frontline," or "I'm a chapel speaker," or "I'm a professor with a couple of doctorates." Is there anything wrong with those things? No, not at all. Unless you think that's your real title. It's not. As a follower of Jesus, you are first and foremost and always will be a servant. You're a slave. Jesus is titled. He's Messiah. He's the Christ. He's the Good Shepherd. He's the Prince of Peace. He's the Wonderful Counselor. He's the light of the world. He's the way, the truth, the life. He's Emmanuel. He is the Son of God. He is the Son of Man. And yet, the entitled one the titled one who deserves to be titled, emptied himself of his glory, restrained his divine qualities and character, and came to us incarnate as a human slave. Can you live down to that? Can you think down to that? So I guess the question I need to ask of you and me as well, what do we need to empty ourselves of in order to take on the true identity of a servant. I'm pretty sure it isn't the glory of your deity. So what could it be? Might be your ego. Maybe that's what you need to empty yourself of. Are you too big, too important, too titled to do the seemingly small and insignificant, the unseen things? Or maybe you need to empty yourself of your assumed rights. I want you to imagine with me just for a moment that you are applying for a ministry position in a church. And so you've got this mental checklist you're running through in your mind because these are the things you want to ask the elders. And because what you're trying to do is just determine if the job is right for you. So maybe you're assuming you wouldn't work more than 42 hours a week. You want to find out how much time you're going to get off. And do you guys give sabbaticals? I'll need to know that. And what about Christmas? Because, see, Christmas is really big for my family, and I'm pretty much going to need to be there with them. And, my wife's expecting. So do you guys give paternity leave? Because that might be a deal breaker. See, we're kind of thinking we want 5 children. I doubt that any of us would be that crass verbally. But any sense of going into that meeting with a bit of entitlement really lacks humility. Or maybe you need to empty yourself of your, dare I say it, your dreams. Your dreams for a mate. Your dreams for children. Your dreams for the perfect location to do your mission work. Or 1,000 other things. Can you trust yourself to the one who calls himself your servant with your life and with your kingdom work? There's tremendous freedom, people, in thinking low. Actually, it's what Timothy Keller calls gospel humility. He says the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less. So with that kind of freedom in mind, I'm telling you, I don't have to prove anything. I don't have to climb ladders. I don't have to have a seat at the table. I don't have to try to gain attention. I don't have to worry about connecting with the right people. When I realize that my title is actually servant of Jesus Christ, I can use all my ambition toward the kingdom, and I don't have to worry about serving myself. Listen to what Stephen Neal has to say to a group of students much like yourself. It's a longer quote, but pay attention to it. For the Christian, there is one place, and only one place, the lowest place. That is the command of the Lord, and it is binding upon us all. As you enter on the work of ministry, you must seek the place of hardest work, greatest sacrifice, and least recognition. And there you must be content. If, when you are toiling contentedly in the lower place, those who have the authority to call men to special spheres in the Lord's vineyard come to you and say, "Friend, come up higher. This place of great eminence and heavier responsibility is the one in which you can now best serve," you may accept the call without fear and without anxiety. But never, 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 if you have yourself desired or sought what is called advancement in the church. You got to think low to know your true title. And then you've got to live high to know your true calling. My goodness, people, go serve in the freedom God has given you. Embrace it. Actually, the disciples themselves finally got it. Those guys who were always seeking position, who were always arguing who was the greatest, they finally take on the title very willingly of servant of Jesus Christ. And they refer to themselves that way. You can read their letters and find out. And because of that, they literally changed the world. You are in partnership with the Holy Spirit. Go listen to Him. Be in submission to Jesus Christ, and it's hard telling what He's going to do with you and what He can do with us collectively. Beth Moore is a very well-known speaker, and she tells one time she was sitting in an airport in Asheville, North Carolina, and she said she was in one of those smaller wings that goes off, and there's a crowd of people sitting there, and it's the kind where your seats are looking at each other. And so she said, I'm just sitting there, and then I look up, and I see the people that are facing me. Their eyes are wide. And she said, I wonder what in the world's going on, and I can tell something's going on behind me because there's movement, and everybody seems to be watching what's happening behind me. And she said, I'm trying to be polite and look, and she said, finally, the hostess, it's a flight hostess, puts an old man in a wheelchair just right down at the end of Beth's row. And she said, I had an overwhelming sense of the Spirit come over me. And she said, I knew God was going to ask me to do something. She said, I looked at that old man. His fingernails were long, like he'd been unkept for so long. He was clean enough. His hair was matted, and it was clear down to here. He was bent over. She said he looked every bit of 129 years old. And she said, I was pretty sure the Lord was going to say to me, Beth, I want you to go witness to that man. And she's saying, I don't think I want to, God. But she said, that's not what He told me to do. And she said, in a voice as clear as a bell like I've never heard before, He said, Beth, go and brush that old man's hair. And she said, I don't even have a brush. But she said, I finally got up and I went and I bent over that old man in front of everybody. And I said, Sir, can I brush your hair? And he said, what? She said, I wanted to know if I can brush your hair. He said, well, I guess if you want to. She said, well, here's the problem. I don't have a hairbrush. And he said, well, I got one in my backpack on the back of this wheelchair. So Beth said, I went and opened up the backpack, and as I was doing so, looking for that brush, she said, I had an overwhelming love for that man come over me. And she said, I began to brush his hair. And she said, after I got through, I leaned down to him, and he's crying. And she said, Sir, are you a Christian? And he said, oh, yes, ma'am. He said, my bride wouldn't have married me if I hadn't become a Christian. And he said, I've been away for months in a hospital. And he said, I was just thinking what my bride must think of me if she saw me show up the way I am now. At least my hair's combed. The flight hostess had been watching all of this, and she's bawling. And the hostess said to Beth, why'd you do that? And Beth said, Jesus told me to. He's so bossy. I feel like I need to give you a warning. That's an inspiring story. It really is. I love that story. But not everything about serving is going to be easy. It doesn't always end pretty. People's lives are messy. And serving it's time consuming, and it's incredibly inconvenient at times, and it's exhausting. Haven't you ever wondered how Jesus served those 12 disciples those 3 years? Can you imagine the clash of personalities that must have been there? The king on the hill attitudes, the way they complained about the people they ministered to. You would have thought it got under their skin. I want to point out a text to you that I find rather fascinating. It's found in John 13. And it's when Jesus is just getting ready to go and wash the disciples' feet. I want you to imagine that scene with me for a moment. They're all reclining at table, but nobody around those tables are willing to get up and wash the others' feet because they don't want to look small. And so the one who's the greatest in the room gets up to serve them. And I have to wonder, how in the world did he do that without rolling his eyes? Without having a martyr's mentality, without scolding the disciples for not knowing better. But this verse is fascinating. John 13:3 says this: Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God, and so he got up. People, what is that saying about the inner life of Christ? It is saying he was confident of who was in control. It was saying that he knew his own identity. And it's saying he knew where he was going. And because of that, he could go serve somebody else with a towel and a basin, or he could go to the cross because he knew he was loved by his Father. I'm going to tell you something. Those things represent the three basic insecurities that we have in our own lives. We desperately need to know who's in control. And if you don't know where your identity is, you're going to be insecure. And if you don't recognize that we're all headed somewhere, so we have purpose, oh people, you get these things solid in your mind, and you can go serve to your heart's content without worrying about who's going to see, or how am I going to look, or whatever it may be, because you are secure in your Father's love. We are the not so with you people. But there's a tension to that. In Mark 10, Peter says to Jesus, Lord, we've given up everything to follow you. And Jesus answered them by saying, anyone who gives up family or possessions will receive now in return 100 times what you've given up. And you wish the sentence would end there, but it doesn't. There's that dash, and he says, and you will experience suffering. Can I just close with my own personal struggles? And this is a conclusion I've come to, and I hope it will be yours as well. Jesus said, follow me. Such inviting words, reviving words, echoing down deep in my soul, luring me to love and know the one who gives this charge to live large, to join a kingdom nation intent on the ruination of Satan's ugly, vile vocation, to bring freedom's liberation in the face of domination, to be the service station for those caught in deprivation, to preach God's great salvation for every generation, then march in celebration for the coming coronation and kneel with all creation in humble adoration. Then behold the destination that is beyond imagination. Oh, I want to shout it. Count me in, King Jesus, Lord, count me in. I'm all on board, with truth held high to defy the lies and comfort the cries of a world that sighs for hope. Let me throw out that gospel rope that saves. I crave that kind of purpose. But did I mention, while it is my conviction, even my intention to answer your call, there is this tension in what I've heard. It may be absurd, but your words, while they've stirred me, they disturb me. Because there is more. Those two words within my hearing, those two words that I was fearing you would say, they are forcing my hand, the mark in the sand glaring, daring me to let go of all ambition and posturing for position, no voicing of conditions, and just die. To cross over the mark and die. I could live with a revision or a second edition of me, but to die? Why so extreme when I'm living the dream? I'm climbing the ladder, the world's on a platter, or so they tell me, sell me. Can I not keep a tithe of my life for me? Why so demanding, commanding? Why ask for the whole? Why ask for total control? That's the battle that rattles my mind, the uncivil war at my heart's core. No guarantee that my destiny will be rosy or cozy or without pain or without rain. No pledge that I might hedge disaster when I give you free rein. But this one thing I cannot ignore. It is what makes my fragile heart soar. The vastness of it I must explore. Is you love us. And you love me. Emptied of glory, you entered our story. To walk in the muck of our sin, you took it on the chin and secured our win by your loss on a rugged cross. It is this love that brings me to my knees. The suffering march to Calvary, hung out to die on a lonely tree, securing the contradictory victory. This is what silences the questions of your validity to rule over my life with sovereignty. So Jesus, when you say follow me, I believe we both agree that I should count the cost. But high or low, where else would I go? It would be utter foolishness to say no. And so, Lord Jesus, I answer your call. Lead on, and I will surrender all. We are the not so with you people. Go serve in his kingdom.